Hello, dear listeners. Today I bring you a story that will deeply touch the heart of each one. It's a narrative about injustice, secrets buried in the past, and a love that blossoms even in the most arid lands of pain. Before I begin, I ask that you please like this video, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories, and comment where you're watching us from. Your presence here is what brings these words to life. Now, allow me to take you to the vast plains of New South Wales in the year 1895. Where the scent of eucalyptus mixes with silent tears, and where a young woman named Ruby carries a burden on her shoulders that should not be hers. The Australian sun rose golden over the sprawling citrus grove that surrounded the grand, pale stone homestead, that imposing structure that dominated the landscape like an arrogant lord over his domains. The trees were laden with ripe fruit, their orange skins gleaming under the morning light, like small jewels hanging on branches twisted by time. The citrus perfume permeated the warm air, mingling with the smell of dry earth and the aroma of white blossoms that still clung to the dark green leaves. It was a scene of poignant beauty, a piece of paradise planted on Australian soil. But for those who knew the truth, that place held secrets as bitter as the seeds hidden in the heart of the fruits. There, between the sweetness of the grove and the cruelty of men, lived Ruby, a young woman of 22, whose brown eyes reflected an ancient sadness, as if carrying in their pupils the memory of injustices that preceded her own birth. Ruby was kneeling among the roots of a centennial citrus tree, her hands stained by the sticky juice of the fruits she had been picking since dawn. She wore a simple, faded cotton dress, patched in several places, and her dark hair was pulled back in a loose bun from which rebellious strands escaped, clinging to her sweaty forehead. Her bare feet trod the warm earth, feeling every stone, every twig, every irregularity of the soil she had known since childhood. Her palms were calloused, marked by years of arduous work, and under her nails accumulated the honest dirt of one who works without rest. She placed the oranges carefully in the wicker basket, one by one, with the delicacy of one who treats each fruit as if it were precious, though she knew she would never taste the benefit of that harvest. From the high balcony of the homestead, Mrs. Martha Jenkins watched the grove with eagle eyes, her thin, rigid figure framed by the white columns that supported the terracotta roof. She was the matriarch who commanded those lands with an iron fist since her husband's death 15 years prior, and her reputation as a severe and calculating woman resonated throughout the district. Always dressed in black, as if in perpetual mourning, she maintained an upright and implacable posture, her thin lips compressed into a line of constant disapproval. Beside her stood Clive, her eldest son, a man of 35, whose attractive face hid a mediocre soul and insatiable ambition. He smoked a cigar with indifference, blowing the smoke into the warm air, while his gaze swept over the lands he considered his unquestionable property, never imagining that the truth was buried much deeper than his selfish roots could reach. "That illegitimate girl works too slowly," Clive murmured with disdain, nodding towards Ruby as he took another puff. "We should hire proper station hands and send her to the kitchen, where she wouldn't hinder the harvest at least." Mrs. Jenkins did not respond immediately. Her dark eyes were fixed on the young woman who moved among the trees with involuntary grace despite the daily humiliation. There was something about that girl that unsettled the matriarch, something in the way she held her chin, even when insulted, in the dignity that persisted, despite all efforts to break her. "She stays where she is, Mrs. Jenkins replied with a voice as sharp as a blade. "It's exactly what an illegitimate child deserves, born of shame and taken in by charity in this house." Ruby heard everything, though she pretended not to. The cruel words reached her, carried by the warm breeze that swayed the citrus leaves, each insult piercing her chest like invisible thorns. She had learned since childhood not to respond, to lower her head and keep working, because any reaction from her would be used as justification for even worse punishments. They told her she was a bastard, daughter of a betrayal, fruit of a sin that was never explained, but which she had to carry like a cross forever. They told her that Mrs. Jenkins had taken her in out of kindness, that she owed eternal gratitude for having a roof over her head and food on her plate. But something inside Ruby, a small but persistent voice, whispered that those words were lies, that there was something wrong with that story, that the truth was hidden somewhere in that homestead where she had been born, but of which she had never felt herself to be the owner. Thomas William Fraser arrived in the New South Wales district on an August afternoon, when the heat was so intense it seemed to melt the stones of the streets and make the air shimmer above the rooftops. He was a man of 38, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair slightly silvered at the temples and deep brown eyes that seemed to see beyond appearances. He wore an impeccable gray linen suit, perfectly tailored to his body, and rode a black horse with white socks that responded to every command with disciplined elegance. His presence emanated natural authority, the kind of respect that doesn't need to be demanded because it simply exists, built on years of correct decisions and unwavering honor. He came from Sydney, where he managed extensive properties and prosperous businesses, but carried in his eyes a shadow of ancient sadness, the mark of a man who had known loss and had learned to live with it without letting it destroy him. 3 years prior, Thomas had lost his wife, Eleanor, to a fever that consumed her in just 5 days, leaving him a widower with no children, alone in a mansion too large for one man. Since then, he had immersed himself in work with an almost obsessive dedication, as if keeping busy could silence the pain that insisted on echoing in the empty halls of his house. He came to the Jenkins station at Mrs. Jenkins's request, who had proposed a commercial alliance involving the export of citrus to European markets through Thomas's contacts. There was also the subtle, almost imperceptible, but present insinuation of a possible union between Thomas and Mabel, Mrs. Jenkins's younger daughter, a young woman of 20 with conventional beauty and a personality molded to please wealthy suitors. Thomas did not ignore these intentions, but remained cautious and distant, willing to evaluate the business, but skeptical of any personal involvement with that family he did not yet truly know. When Thomas crossed the gates of the homestead, his eyes fell for the first time on the vast citrus grove that stretched out like a green and gold sea. Something in his chest tightened with an emotion he couldn't name. The beauty of that place was moving, almost sacred, and he slowed his horse to absorb the sight with respectful attention. It was then that he saw her. Among the farthest trees, a female figure moved with contained grace, her arms raised to reach the highest fruits, her body outlined against the golden afternoon light. Ruby was facing away from him, completely unaware of his presence, concentrated on her task with a dedication that bordered on reverence. Something in the scene deeply touched Thomas. Perhaps the harmony between the woman and the land, perhaps the evident dignity even in that humble work, or perhaps simply the pure and inexplicable beauty of a perfect moment that offered itself to his eyes, tired of searching for meaning where there was none. Mrs. Jenkins received Thomas at the homestead entrance with calculated formality, her mouth forming a smile that didn't reach her eyes as she extended her gloved hand to greet him. "Mr. Fraser, what an honor to receive you at our humble property," she said with a sugary voice that contrasted with the hardness Thomas had perceived in her gaze. Clive stood beside his mother, exuding an excessive confidence that barely disguised the insecurity of one who had never earned anything through his own merit. Mabel appeared moments later, descending the staircase in a light blue dress that enhanced her delicate figure, her blonde hair arranged in elaborate curls that must have taken hours to prepare. She was pretty in a conventional and studied way, but her blue eyes seemed devoid of depth, like deep lakes where there were no mysteries to discover. Thomas greeted everyone with impeccable courtesy, but his mind remained caught on that image of the woman among the citrus trees, a vision that refused to disappear from his thoughts. Dinner was served in the main drawing room, a spacious room decorated with heavy dark wooden furniture and silver chandeliers that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Ruby served the table in silence, moving like a shadow among the guests, filling wine glasses and bringing platters of food without ever raising her eyes. Thomas immediately noticed the contrast between her and the others, not only in the simple, worn clothes she wore, but in the way she was treated. Mrs. Jenkins spoke of her in the third person, even when she was in the room, as if she were an object incapable of hearing or feeling. "The illegitimate girl at least learned to serve well," the matriarch commented lightly, as Ruby placed a platter of roasted lamb on the table. Thomas felt something uncomfortable twist in his stomach upon hearing those words, and for the first time that night, he allowed himself to look directly at the young woman, serving in silence. When his eyes met hers, for a brief instant, Thomas felt as if the world stopped turning. Ruby's eyes were deep brown, full of ancient pain, but also of a silent strength that caught him completely off guard. She immediately averted her gaze, lowering her head as if she had committed a transgression. But that second of connection was enough to engrave her image on Thomas's soul with an intensity that frightened him. He noticed her hands marked by work, her delicate but calloused fingers, her short, clean nails, despite the inevitable dirt from a day in the grove. He noticed her upright posture even in forced submission, the chin that insisted on not bowing completely, even when humiliation tried to break her. And something within him, something that had remained dormant since Eleanor's death, awoke with a disturbing urgency, an inexplicable need to know who that woman was, and why she was being treated like dirt when everything about her screamed nobility. That night, Ruby lay in the small room she occupied at the back of the homestead, a narrow room with a straw bed, an old table, and a window overlooking the stables. The smell of manure mingled with the perfume of citrus that the wind brought from the grove, creating a strange combination she had learned to consider normal. She couldn't sleep, her mind returning again and again to that moment at dinner, when her eyes met those of the stranger from Sydney. There was something in his gaze that had unsettled her inside, a gentleness she wasn't accustomed to, a curiosity that seemed to see her as a person and not an object of contempt. Ruby knew it was dangerous to allow herself hope that men like him wouldn't look twice at women like her. But still her heart insisted on beating faster when she remembered those brown eyes that seemed to see beyond the worn clothes and calloused hands. While Ruby wrestled with thoughts she shouldn't have, Thomas walked around the luxurious room they had assigned him, unable to find rest. The windows were open to the warm night, and from there he could see the expanse of the grove under the silver moonlight, the tops of the citrus trees swaying softly in the night breeze. Something about that property didn't fit, a subtle dissonance that his business-trained instinct picked up without being able to define exactly. The way Mrs. Jenkins had spoken of the land seemed excessively defensive, as if she were constantly justifying a possession that should be unquestionable. The way Clive avoided speaking of the deceased Mr. George Watson, the former owner who had died 15 years ago, and primarily the cruelty with which they treated that young woman who served the table. A cruelty that seemed disproportionate even by the standards of a society that accepted class differences as natural. Thomas decided he would stay as long as necessary, not only to evaluate the proposed business, but to understand what was truly happening in that homestead, surrounded by citrus trees. There were mysteries buried in that land. He could feel them as if they were invisible roots, beating beneath his feet, and his meticulous and just nature would not allow him to ignore injustices, even when they weren't his problem. Moreover, and he barely dared admit it to himself, there was that woman with sad eyes and hands marked by work, that silent presence that had stirred something deep in his chest, something he had sworn not to allow to be touched again. Thomas approached the window and rested his hands on the stone sill, breathing deeply the air perfumed by the Australian night, and made a silent promise to himself that he would discover the truth about Ruby, whatever the cost, because something in him knew that that woman held secrets that could change everything. The following days established a strange routine, filled with unspoken tensions. Thomas spent his mornings discussing business with Mrs. Jenkins and Clive, analyzing export documents and commercial contracts, but his mind often wandered to the grove, where he knew Ruby worked under the unforgiving sun. He began to find excuses to walk among the citrus trees, saying he needed to personally evaluate the quality of the fruit, but in reality, he was only seeking glimpses of that woman who intrigued him more and more. Ruby sensed his presence and felt simultaneously perturbed and strangely comforted by it, as if that man brought with him a possibility of change she dared not name. They didn't converse, for the social abyss separating them made any approach inappropriate, but their gazes met with increasing frequency, and each gaze lasted a second longer than the previous one. One morning, Thomas saw Ruby stumble while carrying a basket that was too heavy, almost falling to her knees among the roots of a tree. Instinctively, he ran to her and held her arm, preventing her fall. The contact was electric, a current that ran through both of them with terrifying intensity. Ruby looked up at him, surprised and frightened, her cheeks reddening with a pink blush that contrasted with the usual paleness of her skin. "I'm sorry, sir," she murmured in a low, melodious voice that Thomas heard for the first time. And the sound of that voice was like forgotten music playing again, after years of silence. "There's nothing to be sorry for," Thomas replied with genuine gentleness, still holding her arm, perhaps longer than necessary. "This basket is too heavy to be carried by one person." Ruby quickly pulled away, freeing herself from his touch with a movement that mixed fear and something more complex she couldn't name. "I've always carried it like this, sir," she said, without looking at him, picking up the basket again and hurrying towards the storeroom. Thomas stood among the citrus trees, watching her disappear among the green shadows, his heart beating in a way it hadn't beaten in 3 years. In that instant, he knew with absolute certainty that he was beginning to feel something for that woman, something deep and inevitable, and that the journey that had begun as a simple business trip had transformed into something much greater, something that would change their lives in ways neither of them could yet imagine. But that fate was already weaving in the perfumed shadows of the citrus grove, where ancient secrets patiently awaited the right moment to come to light. The forced cohabitation under the same roof began to reveal layers of truth that Mrs. Jenkins would prefer to keep buried. Thomas was too observant, too attentive, and his constant presence in the homestead functioned like an intense light cast on dark corners where spiders had been weaving their webs for years. He noticed small details that others would ignore. The way Ruby was prevented from eating at the table even when there was leftover food. How she was sent to sleep in the back while entire rooms remained empty and locked. How her name was never pronounced with respect, but always with disdain or indifference. He also noticed the strange contradiction of a family that claimed to own everything, but avoided showing complete documents, that spoke of inheritances but never of wills, that mentioned Mr. George Watson only superficially, as if his memory were forbidden territory. Each observation accumulated in Thomas's meticulous mind, like pieces of a puzzle that still didn't form a complete picture, but whose outline was beginning to be drawn with disturbing profiles. On an especially hot afternoon, when the sun turned the grove into a golden furnace, Thomas decided to approach Ruby more directly. He found her kneeling beside an old cistern, washing her hands stained with citrus juice in the cold water that flowed from an iron tap. She didn't hear him arrive, absorbed in the simple task of cleaning her work-marked skin, and Thomas allowed himself to observe her for an instant before announcing his presence. There was something profoundly beautiful in that ordinary scene. The young woman bent over the water, her dark hair escaping from her bun and forming small damp curls on her sweaty nape, her delicate hands rubbing together with circular movements that betrayed years of automatic repetition. When Thomas finally cleared his throat to announce himself, Ruby jumped up, startled like a wild animal caught in a moment of vulnerability, her eyes wide and her body tense, ready to flee. "Excuse me, I didn't mean to startle you," Thomas said softly, maintaining a respectful distance so as not to increase her discomfort. Ruby immediately lowered her gaze, clasping her wet hands in front of her body in a defensive gesture that broke Thomas's heart. "There's nothing to forgive, sir," she replied in an almost inaudible voice. And Thomas perceived that it was always the same phrase, always the same words of automatic submission that she repeated, as if she had been trained never to complain about anything. "What's your name?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer, because he wanted to hear it from her. He wanted her to pronounce her own name as an act of recognition of her own existence. Ruby hesitated, confused that someone would ask her something everyone there already knew or pretended to know. "Ruby, sir," she finally murmured, and the name sounded beautiful in her own voice, more beautiful than when Mrs. Jenkins pronounced it with contempt. "Ruby," Thomas repeated, savoring the name as if it were the first time he'd heard it. "It's a beautiful name, a name of precious jewels." She didn't know how to respond to that. She wasn't accustomed to kindness or compliments, and the silence stretched between them, laden with a tension that wasn't uncomfortable, but strangely intimate. Thomas took another step towards her, careful as one approaching a wounded bird. "How long have you worked in this grove?" he asked, genuinely interested, and Ruby finally looked up to meet his gaze, surprised by the attention. "Since forever, sir," she replied in a still low, but slightly firmer voice. "I was born in this homestead and grew up among these citrus trees. I know no other place." The information confirmed suspicions Thomas already harbored, and he frowned slightly, processing the implications of those simple words. "Then you knew Mr. George Watson, the former owner of these lands?" Thomas asked, with calculated care, keenly observing her reaction. Ruby's face immediately transformed, a shadow of deep pain crossing her delicate features like a dark cloud over the full moon. "Yes, I knew him, sir," she replied, her voice broken by contained emotion. He was good to me when I was a child. He called me his citrus girl, and sometimes brought me sweets from town when he returned from Sydney." Tears gleamed in the corners of her eyes, but she blinked hard to prevent them from falling, as if crying were a luxury she couldn't afford. Thomas felt something tighten in his chest at that display of controlled vulnerability, that ancient pain she carried like a silent burden. "And when he died, what happened?" Thomas pressed, knowing he was treading delicate ground, but unable to retreat now that he had come so close to the truth. Ruby bit her lower lip, visibly struggling with the decision to speak or remain silent, and Thomas could see fear battling against a desperate need to finally be heard by someone. "Everything changed, sir," she whispered at last, her voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. "Mrs. Jenkins said I was nothing, that I was never anything, that my mother had me with just any man and that Mr. Watson took me in out of pity. She said I should be grateful for having a place to sleep and food to eat, even if it was in the back and from the scraps." The words came out in a painful torrent, as if a dam had finally given way under years of accumulated pressure, and Thomas understood that it was probably the first time Ruby had verbalized her own story to someone who truly listened. Thomas took another step towards her, moved by an impulse that defied all social conventions, and did something that surprised them both. He extended his hand and gently touched Ruby's shoulder in a gesture of pure, respectful comfort. She shivered under the contact, not from fear, but from shock. At a tenderness she hadn't received in so long, she had almost forgotten how it felt. "Ruby," Thomas said with a firm voice, but laden with compassion. "Look at me." She obeyed slowly, raising her now tear-brightened, unshed brown eyes to meet his. "I want you to know that I don't believe anything they say about you. I don't know the truth yet, but I know lies when I see them, and there are too many lies in this homestead." His words were risky, almost a declaration of war against the hosts who sheltered him. But Thomas no longer cared about diplomacy when justice was at stake. Ruby was speechless, looking at that man who had appeared in her life like an unexpected storm, bringing with him the disturbing possibility of change. For the first time in 15 years, since Mr. George Watson's death, someone looked at her as if she were a person of worth, as if her story mattered, as if she deserved more than the ground she trod. The emotion that seized her chest was so intense that she had to look away again, frightened by the intensity of what she felt. "You shouldn't say those things," she murmured, in a trembling voice. "Mrs. Jenkins won't like it. She might send you away, or worse." Thomas smiled for the first time since arriving at that homestead. A small but genuine smile that illuminated his serious face. "Mrs. Jenkins doesn't tell me what to do," he replied with quiet firmness. "I am a free and wealthy man, and I don't bow my head to anyone who practices injustice." The conversation was abruptly interrupted by Mabel's shrill voice, calling from the homestead. "Mr. Fraser, Mother is looking for you." The young blonde appeared on the balcony, waving an embroidered handkerchief and a forced smile that barely disguised the jealousy burning in her eyes at seeing Thomas conversing with the servant. Ruby immediately recoiled, as if burned, and murmured a quick, "Excuse me, sir," before practically running towards the tool shed, disappearing among the shadows of the citrus trees like a ghost fleeing the light. Thomas stood there a moment longer, watching the spot where she had disappeared before sighing deeply and walking slowly back to the homestead, where Mabel waited for him with insipid smiles and empty conversations about the new dress the seamstress was finishing. That night, during another formal dinner that seemed to drag on eternally, Thomas observed with renewed attention the dynamics of that family that received him with false courtesies. Mrs. Jenkins sat at the head of the table like a queen on her throne, controlling the conversation with an iron hand disguised by a velvet glove. Clive drank too much wine and spoke too loudly about conquests that had probably never happened, exaggerating stories of successful businesses that wouldn't withstand 5 minutes of serious verification. Mabel chattered incessantly about dances and dresses, trying to attract Thomas's attention with comments she considered witty, but which sounded only superficial and childish. And Ruby, always Ruby, moved silently among them, like a shadow, serving dishes and filling glasses, never participating in the conversation, never being recognized as a human presence worthy of consideration. Thomas decided to test the waters in a calculatedly provocative way. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said in a casual voice during a pause in the conversation, "I've been thinking about the history of this property. Was Mr. George Watson a relative of yours?" The question was simple, but the effect was immediate. The matriarch's face hardened almost imperceptibly, and her fingers gripped her cutlery with excessive force before responding. "He was my husband, Mr. Fraser," she replied in a controlled but tense voice. "We married over 40 years ago, and he left me these lands when he departed for eternal rest." The answer was true, but Thomas perceived what it omitted. She didn't speak of a will, didn't mention official documents, only affirmed possession as if it were obvious and unquestionable. "And there were no other heirs?" Thomas insisted, feigning only polite curiosity as he keenly observed the reactions around the table. The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Clive choked slightly on his wine, and Mabel stopped chattering abruptly, looking nervously at her mother. Ruby, who was serving soup from a tureen near the door, became completely motionless, like a salt statue. "Mrs. Jenkins quickly composed herself, but not before Thomas saw the flicker of true panic cross her dark eyes. "No, Mr. Fraser," she replied, in a voice too firm, too controlled. "My husband left no other heirs, only myself and my children." The lie hung in the air like toxic smoke, visible only to one who knew how to look for it. And Thomas knew at that moment that he was on the right track. There were secrets in that house, secrets that Mrs. Jenkins guarded tooth and nail, and he was determined to uncover them, even if it meant declaring open war against that family who feigned hospitality while practicing cruelties in the shadows. In the following days, Thomas began to investigate discreetly, but with methodical determination. He visited the local registrar's office in town one morning, under the pretext of having business in the city, and there he spoke at length with the solicitor, an elderly man named Mr. Thompson, who had known Mr. George Watson personally. The solicitor was cautious at first, protected by the rules of confidentiality that governed his profession. But Thomas had the ability to inspire trust and also knew how to ask the right questions in a way that seemed like mere polite curiosity from a potential investor. Mr. Watson was a man of strong character, Mr. Thompson said, with evident nostalgia, his old eyes gleaming with memories. A just man, generous with his workers, always paid on time, and treated everyone with a rare dignity in these times. There was something else the old man wanted to say. Thomas could feel it, but the words seemed stuck in the solicitor's throat, as if held by an ancient fear. "I heard he died suddenly," Thomas commented with apparent naturalness, glancing at old records Mr. Thompson had placed on the dark wooden table stained with ink. The solicitor nodded slowly, his wrinkled face creasing into an expression of discomfort. "Yes, very suddenly. He was well in the morning and dead by nightfall. They say it was his heart, but—" He hesitated, looking around as if fearing the walls had ears. "But there were rumors at the time. Nothing proven, you understand. Just whispers that people like me shouldn't repeat." Thomas leaned forward, intensifying his gaze in a way that conveyed absolute seriousness. "Mr. Thompson, I am a man of honor, and I know how to keep confidences. If there's anything I should know about this family before closing business with them, I'd prefer to know it now than discover it too late." The argument worked, appealing to the old solicitor's sense of justice. Mr. Thompson sighed deeply, visibly struggling with himself before finally giving in. "There was a little girl," he murmured in a voice so low Thomas had to lean closer to hear. "A little girl whom Mr. Watson adored. Some said she was his daughter from before his marriage. Others whispered she was his sister's child, who died in childbirth. The truth was never clear, but Mr. Watson treated her with special affection. He called her his citrus girl." Thomas felt his heart race, the pieces of the puzzle finally beginning to fit. "And what happened to that girl?" he asked, already knowing the answer, but needing to hear it confirmed. "Mrs. Jenkins sent her to the back of the homestead when Mr. Watson died," Mr. Thompson replied with evident sadness. "She said the girl was an illegitimate child with no rights, that she would only stay out of charity. But there were those who said Mr. Watson had left a will that was never officially presented." The revelation fell like a silent bomb between them, and Thomas knew he had just uncovered the tip of a secret that could destroy everything. Mrs. Jenkins had built on lies. Thomas returned to the homestead, with the weight of new knowledge pressing on his chest like a stone. He couldn't openly accuse without concrete proof. He couldn't confront Mrs. Jenkins based only on rumors and the suspicions of an elderly solicitor. But now he knew what to look for and where to dig. Ruby was the citrus girl, the child Mr. Watson loved, and very likely the true heir whose inheritance had been stolen by a cruel stepmother who had taken advantage of her husband's sudden and all too convenient death. The injustice of it all made Thomas's blood boil, but he forced himself to remain calm and think strategically. He needed documentary evidence. He needed the will Mr. Thompson had mentioned, and for that he would need access to the homestead's private archives, to the locked chests and secret drawers where Mrs. Jenkins probably hid the truth away from prying eyes. That afternoon, Thomas found Ruby again in the grove, but this time she was sitting in the shade of a centennial citrus tree, her knees hugged to her chest and her gaze lost on the golden horizon where the sun began its descent. There was something profoundly melancholic in that image, something that touched Thomas in a visceral and painful way. He approached in silence and sat beside her without asking permission, breaking all rules of social etiquette, but not caring in the slightest. Ruby started slightly, but did not get up, and that small gesture of permanence seemed more significant to Thomas than any words. They remained in silence for long minutes, simply sharing the space under the tree, while the citrus perfume enveloped them and the birds sang their evening music in the treetops around them. "Do you remember your mother?" Thomas asked at last, in a soft voice that didn't demand an answer, but only offered a safe space for her to speak if she wished. Ruby took so long to respond that he thought she wouldn't, but then she murmured, her voice laden with an ancient pain. "No, sir. Mrs. Jenkins says she died when I was born, that she was a woman of no importance, whom Mr. Watson took in out of kindness. But sometimes I have dreams. Dreams of a woman with dark hair who smells of lavender and sings me songs in a low voice. I don't know if they are true memories or just desires of my mind." Thomas felt like embracing her, protecting her from all the pain she carried, but he knew it would be inappropriate and might frighten her. Instead, he said with a quiet firmness that admitted no doubt, "Ruby, I promise you that I will discover the truth about who you really are, and when I do, can be out, I will see that justice is done, whatever the cost." The following weeks brought a subtle but perceptible change in the atmosphere of the homestead. Thomas remained there under the pretext of thoroughly evaluating the proposed business, examining every aspect of citrus production, contracts with distributors, possible export routes, but everyone knew his reasons for staying went beyond the numbers in the ledgers. Mrs. Jenkins began to show signs of impatience, her forced smiles becoming increasingly strained, her questions about when Thomas would finalize the analysis becoming more frequent and less veiled. Clive oscillated between trying to impress the visitor with increasingly exaggerated stories and showing barely disguised irritation at his prolonged presence. Mabel, for her part, had intensified her seductive efforts with a desperation that bordered on pathetic, appearing in increasingly elaborate dresses and casting glances she considered alluring, but which in Thomas's eyes seemed only calculating and empty. Ruby, on the other hand, blossomed in an almost imperceptible but real way. Thomas's respectful attention, their brief but meaningful conversations in the grove, the way he treated her as a person worthy of consideration, all of it planted seeds of hope in a soil she had believed barren forever. She began to hold her head a little higher when she walked, to allow small smiles to grace her lips when she was alone among the citrus trees, to daydream about possibilities that once seemed absolutely impossible. It wasn't love yet. It was too soon to name such deep feelings, but there was a connection growing between them, like a root searching for water underground, invisible on the surface, but strong and persistent in its search for sustenance. Thomas felt drawn to her in ways that went beyond the physical, fascinated by her silent strength, her unbreakable dignity despite years of humiliation, her ability to maintain kindness in her heart when she had every right to become bitter and cruel. On an especially warm afternoon, when the sun turned the grove into a golden cathedral of light filtered through the leaves, Thomas made a decision that would change the course of everything. He needed concrete proof, and that proof was hidden somewhere within the homestead, probably in Mr. George Watson's private study, which Mrs. Jenkins now kept locked, and whose key she guarded with obsessive zeal. Thomas knew that entering there without permission was risky, potentially disastrous if he were discovered, but his need for justice was stronger than prudence. He waited until night, when the house plunged into the heavy silence of the Australian sleep, and then he slipped through the corridors like a shadow, avoiding the floorboards he knew creaked, walking barefoot to muffle any sound that might betray his presence on that clandestine expedition in search of buried truths. The study door was locked, as expected, but Thomas had not come unprepared. He had brought small tools hidden in the pocket of his dressing gown, instruments he had learned to use years ago, when he was still young and reckless, before wealth and respect had turned him into the serious man he was now. The lock yielded after a few minutes of careful work, and Thomas entered the room, closed for years, his heart pounding with a mixture of adrenaline and anticipation. The study smelled of mold and old paper, an odor of stop time that invaded his nostrils as he silently closed the door behind him. Moonlight streamed through the dusty windows, casting silver streaks on furniture covered by white sheets that looked like ghosts awaiting resurrection. Thomas lit a small candle he had brought with him, and the flickering flame revealed shelves full of dusty books, a heavy dark wooden desk, and several chests piled against the opposite wall. Thomas started with the desk, opening drawers that at first resisted before yielding with protesting creaks. Most contained old business papers, contracts for buying and selling citrus, correspondence with distributors, nothing of particular interest. But in the last drawer, the deepest and most securely locked, he found something that quickened his pulse. An envelope sealed with red wax bearing the seal of a local Sydney solicitor. Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he broke the ancient seal and pulled the documents from inside, holding them close to the flickering candlelight to read the contents. What he read on the time-yellowed pages confirmed all his suspicions and revealed a truth even more shocking than he had imagined. It wasn't just a will, it was a comprehensive letter from Mr. George Watson, written 3 days before his death, detailing not only his last wishes, but also confessions that completely changed the narrative Mrs. Jenkins had constructed about Ruby's origins. The letter began formally, but soon became deeply personal. Mr. Watson's elegant handwriting trembled in certain passages, as if emotion had affected his hand, as he wrote, "I write these words with a heart heavy with regrets I have carried for too long," the text read. "Ruby Elizabeth Watson is not the daughter of some woman of no importance, nor an illegitimate child from a casual encounter, as my wife Martha always claimed. Ruby is the daughter of my beloved sister, Elizabeth, who died bringing her into the world 22 years ago. Elizabeth was an honorable widow, married to Edward Watson, a respected merchant who died in an accident 6 months before the child's birth. The property I own, including the homestead and the entire citrus grove, does not belong to me by right, but was an inheritance left by Edward to his wife Elizabeth, and consequently to their daughter Ruby. Thomas had to reread the passage 3 times before the full implications penetrated his mind, stunned by the magnitude of the revelation. Thomas's hands trembled as he continued reading, the candle dripping hot wax onto the desk as he devoured every word of that posthumous confession. Mr. Watson continued, "I assumed administration of the property after Elizabeth's death, with the promise to protect Ruby and preserve her inheritance until she was old enough to understand. But I made the fatal mistake of trusting Martha, of believing she would welcome the child with maternal kindness. I was terribly wrong. Martha always harbored jealousy towards Elizabeth. She always envied my sister's beauty and kindness, and transferred that hatred to the innocent child. I tried to protect Ruby as best I could, but my health is declining, and I fear my days are numbered. Therefore, I record here, with witnesses and official seal, that upon reaching 25 years of age, Ruby Elizabeth Watson must assume complete possession of all lands, the homestead, and properties that by right of blood and law belong to her as the sole heir of Edward Watson and Elizabeth Watson, née Smith." Thomas felt rage boil in his veins like incandescent lava. Ruby was not an illegitimate child, taken in by charity. She was the true owner of those lands, while Mrs. Jenkins was merely the wife of the uncle who had temporarily managed the orphan niece's inheritance. And what's more, Ruby was about to turn 25, meaning the moment of legal transfer was approaching, and Mrs. Jenkins, without a doubt, knew it. That was why the urgency to close export deals, perhaps trying to divert funds before the truth came to light. The cruelty with which they treated Ruby took on a new dimension of monstrosity. It wasn't just abuse of power. It was a deliberate attempt to break the spirit of the true heir, to keep her so humiliated and ignorant that she would never dare to question her position or discover the truth about her origins. Thomas folded the documents with reverent care, tucked them inside his coat, and continued his search, now with renewed urgency, knowing he needed more proof birth and marriage certificates that would confirm the story told by Mr. George Watson. Before he could continue his investigation, Thomas heard footsteps in the corridor. His heart froze for an instant, before years of training in tense negotiations took over. He quickly extinguished the candle, plunging the study into darkness broken only by moonlight, and hid behind the door, silently praying that whoever was outside wouldn't enter. The footsteps stopped exactly in front of the study door, and Thomas could hear heavy breathing from the other side of the wood. For long seconds that felt like hours, nothing happened, only tense silence, and held breaths on both sides of the door. Then the footsteps resumed, slowly moving away down the corridor, and Thomas finally allowed himself to breathe again, cold sweat running down his back despite the warm night. He waited 10 more minutes before daring to leave, making sure to relock the door and erase any sign of his intrusion before slipping back to his room with the precious documents hidden against his chest, like a treasure stolen from a sleeping dragon. Now, dear listeners, I'd like to pause our story to ask you something. What would you do in Ruby's place if you discovered that everything you were told about yourself was a lie? That the humiliation suffered for years was based on cruel falsehoods? Comment below with your opinion, as it's always enriching to know what you think and feel. And now we will continue with the revelation that will change everything for our protagonist. The next morning, Thomas awoke with a firm decision to tell Ruby everything. She had a right to know who she really was. She had a right to know the truth about her parents and her stolen inheritance. But he also knew that he needed to do it carefully, that such a revelation could be devastating for someone who had spent her entire life believing herself to be less than nothing. He waited until the afternoon, when he knew Ruby would be in the grove, and walked towards it with the documents carefully tucked inside his coat. He found her by the same citrus tree where they had conversed before. And when she looked up and saw him approaching, something in his face must have betrayed the seriousness of the moment, because she immediately became tense, like an animal sensing a distant storm. "Ruby," Thomas began in a soft but firm voice, "I need to speak with you about something very important, something that will change your life completely." She looked at him with wide eyes, fear and hope mixing in equal parts in her gaze. Thomas sat on the ground at the foot of the tree, inviting her with a gentle gesture to do the same. And when she obeyed with hesitant movements, he took the documents from his coat and held them between them like a bridge between past and future. "What I am about to tell you may be hard to believe at first, but I have proof here for every word I will say," he continued, carefully observing her face to gauge her reactions. You are not who Mrs. Jenkins said you were. You are not an illegitimate child without a name, nor a charity case. You are Ruby Elizabeth Watson, daughter of Elizabeth Watson and Edward Watson, and by right of blood and law, you are the true owner of this homestead and all these lands." The silence that followed was absolute and crystalline. Ruby remained completely motionless, her eyes fixed on Thomas, as if he had spoken in an incomprehensible foreign language. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out, and Thomas saw the exact instant when the words finally penetrated her consciousness, when the truth began to dismantle, brick by brick, the prison of lies in which she had lived, confined for 22 years. "No, it can't be," she finally whispered, her voice choked. "Mrs. Jenkins said. She always said my mother was." Her voice broke completely, and the tears she had fought to hold back all her life finally burst forth, gushing from her eyes like broken dams, drenching her face and dripping onto her simple dress, while her entire body trembled with sobs that came from the depths of her soul. Thomas didn't think, he just acted on instinct, drawing her into his arms and pressing her against his chest as she wept years of pain, humiliation, and loss in her salty tears. Thomas held Ruby as she cried, one hand gently stroking her dark hair and the other holding her firmly against him, offering the silent comfort of a presence that didn't judge her pain but validated it completely. He could feel her body trembling. He could feel the dampness of her tears soaking his shirt, and something within him broke and reconfigured at the same time, as if holding that broken woman in his arms was the most important and sacred act of his entire life. They remained like that for long minutes, the world reduced only to the two of them under the citrus tree, the citrus perfume enveloping them like a protective mantle, while the sun filtered through the leaves, drew patterns of light and shadow over their entwined bodies. When Ruby's sobs finally began to subside, transforming into irregular, trembling breaths, Thomas gently pulled her away, just enough to be able to look into her swollen, reddened eyes. "Everything Mrs. Jenkins told you was a lie," Thomas repeated with quiet firmness, cupping her face in his large, gentle hands. "Your mother was an honorable woman, legally married, and you are the legitimate daughter of a blessed union. Your father was a respected merchant, and your mother was Mr. George Watson's sister, which means he was your uncle, not some stranger who took you in out of pity." Each word was like a balm applied to wounds opened decades ago, and Ruby drank them with the thirst of one who had spent her entire life in the desert and finally found fresh water. "And, what's more," Thomas continued, his voice growing even more serious, "these lands do not belong to Mrs. Jenkins, nor to her children. They belong to you. Your father left everything to your mother, and your mother left everything to you. Mr. Watson only administered the property until you came of age, and he left a clear will, stating that at 25, you should assume possession of everything." Ruby looked at Thomas as if she were seeing an angel or perhaps a ghost, her mind struggling to process information that contradicted everything she had believed about herself for as long as she could remember. But I don't know how to do anything but pick fruit," she murmured in a weak, lost voice. "How can I own all of this? How can I—" Thomas silenced her gently, placing a finger on her lips, and the intimate gesture made both of them intensely aware of the physical closeness they maintained, of how they were still almost embracing under the tree. "You will learn," Thomas said, with absolute conviction. "You are intelligent and strong, Ruby. You survived years of cruelty that would have broken weaker people. Managing a property is a smaller challenge than enduring what you endured." He paused, taking a deep breath before offering the next thing, which would change everything between them. "And if you allow me, I will help you. I will teach you everything I know about business and administration. I will be by your side every step of this process." Ruby's eyes met Thomas's, and something passed between them in that moment, something deep and inexplicable that went beyond gratitude or a strategic alliance. It was a mutual recognition of souls that met at the exact instant they needed each other most. It was the beginning of something neither of them dared yet to name, but which both felt pulsating in the air charged between their bodies, too close to be just casual acquaintances. "Why are you doing this for me?" Ruby asked in a trembling voice, genuinely confused by the unexpected kindness of a man who owed her nothing. Thomas smiled, a small, sad smile that carried the weight of his own losses. "Because justice matters," he replied with simple honesty. "And because you matter, Ruby. You matter more than you should to someone I met so recently, but it's the truth, and I won't pretend otherwise." The confession hung between them like an unspoken promise, and Ruby felt something warm in her chest, something that started small like an ember but which she knew could grow into a fire if she allowed it. She had never been courted. She had never received romantic attention from any man. For who would look twice at the illegitimate girl who worked barefoot in the grove? But Thomas looked, and more than that, Thomas saw. He saw not only what she was, but what she had always been despite all efforts to make her forget. A woman of worth, of dignity, with rights that had been stolen from her, but which could be restored. I also, she began hesitantly, blushing intensely as she struggled to find adequate words for feelings she had never learned to express. I also feel that you matter to me in ways I don't understand, but which I cannot deny. The confession came out in an embarrassed whisper, but Thomas heard every word as if they were shouts, resonating in an empty cathedral. He moved closer to her, so close he could count the small golden freckles scattered across her nose, so close he could see the tiny green flecks in her brown eyes, so close that their breaths mingled in the minuscule space that separated them. "Ruby," Thomas murmured, his voice hoarse with contained emotion, "I know it's too soon. I know there's much to resolve before we can think of ourselves, but I need you to know that my feelings don't depend on you being an heiress or a servant. I was interested in you when I still believed you were just a worker in the grove, and I am even more interested now that I know the full truth about your strength and your survival." It was a bold declaration, almost a veiled proposal, and both knew it. Ruby closed her eyes, allowing herself for an instant just to feel, just to exist, in that suspended space where cruel reality had not yet reached them, where they were just a man and a woman, discovering that the heart has its own will that defies logic and convenience. And in that perfect moment, under the citrus tree, with the Australian sun warming their skin and the perfume of white blossoms enveloping them like a blessing, Ruby allowed herself, for the first time in her life, to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, she deserved to be happy. The days that followed the revelation were of silent and strategic preparation. Thomas knew that confronting Mrs. Jenkins openly without an adequate strategy would be disastrous, as she had years of experience in manipulation and control, as well as allies in town who could mobilize against them if she felt truly threatened. He needed to act with surgical intelligence, gathering not only the documents he already possessed, but also credible witnesses and legal support that would make it impossible for Mrs. Jenkins to question or hide the truth. Ruby, for her part, struggled daily against the urge to confront the woman who had humiliated her all her life. But Thomas had advised her to maintain normal appearances, to continue working in the grove as she always had, so as not to arouse suspicion before they were fully prepared. It was torture for her to feign submission now that she knew the truth, but she fully trusted Thomas, and that trust was the foundation upon which they built not only a legal strategy, but also a growing emotional intimacy. Thomas made 2 more trips to Sydney during that week, always under the pretext of business related to citrus export, but in reality, visiting the solicitor who had registered Mr. George Watson's original will and the Reverend Miller of the local church, who kept records of baptisms, marriages, and deaths. The Reverend Miller, an elderly man, remembered Ruby's baptism perfectly and the tragedy that had been Elizabeth's death. "She was a woman of extraordinary goodness," the Reverend said. His eyes filled with tears at the memory. "She lost her husband too young and died bringing life into the world, leaving the child an orphan before even drawing her first breath. Mr. Watson personally promised me he would care for the child as if she were his own daughter, and for years he kept that promise." The Reverend paused, sighing heavily before continuing. "But after he died, everything changed. I tried to intervene when I learned how they treated the child, but Mrs. Jenkins is a powerful and influential woman, and my words were ignored as undue interference in family matters." Reverend Miller provided Thomas with certified copies of all relevant records: Elizabeth and Edward Watson's marriage certificate, Ruby Watson's birth certificate, listing both parents with full names, and Elizabeth's death certificate, specifying the cause of death as complications of childbirth. Each document was an additional piece of the puzzle Thomas meticulously assembled, each piece of evidence another nail in the coffin of Mrs. Jenkins's lies. The solicitor was also cooperative, moved by a sense of justice that years of bureaucratic work had not managed to completely extinguish. He prepared official documentation confirming the authenticity of Mr. Complant, George Watson's will, and provided property records that traced the chain of possession of the lands from Edward Watson to the present moment. "It always seemed strange to me that Mrs. Jenkins never officially presented the will," the solicitor commented as he prepared the papers. "She simply assumed control of everything after Mr. Watson's death, and no one questioned her because he was her husband, and she seemed to be the natural heir. But now I see it was a calculated coup. taking advantage of a vulnerable orphan. While Thomas built his legal case, Ruby underwent a profound internal transformation. Knowing the truth about her origins not only changed her understanding of the past, but completely reorganized her perception of herself and her place in the world. She began to recall small details from childhood that had previously seemed insignificant, but now acquired new meaning. The way Mr. Watson looked at her with special tenderness. The times he called her "my dear niece" when Mrs. Jenkins wasn't around. The gifts he secretly gave her that she had to hide so they wouldn't be confiscated. These were fragmented memories of an uncle who had tried to protect her within the limitations of his unhappy marriage to a cruel woman. And now, these memories became precious treasures she kept in her heart, as proof that she had been loved, that she was not disposable rubbish, but a person of value to someone who had truly known her. The relationship between Ruby and Thomas deepened each day, built on a solid foundation of mutual respect and genuine admiration. They met in the grove whenever possible, sharing conversations that went beyond legal strategy and delved into more personal and intimate territories. Thomas spoke of his wife, Eleanor, of the love they shared and the pain of losing her, and for the first time since her death, he managed to speak without sadness, crushing him completely. Ruby listened with reverent attention, never competing with Eleanor's memory, but honoring her as an important part of Thomas's story. She, in turn, shared childhood memories of the grove, of the dreams she had learned not to have, of the nights she cried silently in the back room, wondering why she had been born only to suffer. These conversations created an intimacy between them that transcended physical attraction, although that also existed, pulsating constantly beneath the surface of every prolonged gaze and every accidental touch that lasted seconds longer than casual. On a particularly significant afternoon, Thomas brought something to Ruby, a new dress of fine, sky-blue cotton, simple, but infinitely prettier and better made than anything she had ever owned. "It's not much," he said with a modesty that didn't match the evident emotion in his eyes. "But I thought you deserved to have something of your own, something chosen for you, and not inherited as leftovers from others." Ruby held the dress with trembling hands, tears immediately springing to her eyes, because no one, absolutely no one, had ever given her a gift chosen specifically for her. It was a simple gesture, but laden with profound meaning. Thomas truly saw her, and wanted her to feel valued, even before legal justice was restored. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever received," she whispered, her voice breaking, clutching the dress to her chest, as if it were an invaluable treasure. And at that moment, something definitively changed between them. An invisible line was crossed, and both knew that what they felt for each other could no longer be denied or minimized. Thomas was aware that his actions could be misinterpreted or used against them by Mrs. Jenkins. So he was careful to keep all his interactions with Ruby within respectable bounds, even when every fiber of his being longed to pull her into his arms and kiss her until she forgot every moment of pain she had lived. But there was a right time for everything, and that time would only come after justice was done, and Ruby was in a secure position from which no one could harm her. He shared these thoughts with her in a frank conversation under the citrus tree that had become a sacred meeting point for them both. "When all this is over," Thomas said, holding her hand in his, "when you are secure in your legitimate position as owner of these lands, then we can think of ourselves, without anyone being able to accuse me of opportunism or you of being a woman who uses charms to gain protection. I want the whole world to know that we chose each other freely, without coercion or need, only because our hearts so decided." Ruby understood the wisdom behind that decision, though her young heart, finally awakened to the possibility of love, wanted to run before it could walk safely. "I will wait as long as necessary," she promised, with a firm voice despite the tears glistening in her eyes. "You gave me back not only my identity, but also my dignity, Thomas. You made me feel that I am worth something, that my existence has a purpose beyond serving those who despise me. That is a gift I can never fully repay." Thomas squeezed her hand with a gentleness that contrasted with the strength of his feelings. "You already repaid me just by existing, just by being exactly who you are. Strong, kind, resilient. You made me feel alive again after 3 years living like a ghost of my own life." The mutual confession sealed an unspoken but absolute commitment between them, a promise of a shared future they would build together once the past of lies was finally unearthed and destroyed. The final preparations were completed 2 weeks after Thomas discovered the will. He now possessed a complete dossier that included Mr. George Watson's original will, birth and marriage certificates, property records, written testimony from Reverend Miller, confirmation from the solicitor, and even statements from former station workers who remembered how Mr. Watson treated Ruby with special affection. Thomas had also contacted a respected barrister from Sydney, Mr. William Campbell, a specialist in inheritance and property law, and had convinced him to come to the district to review the case. Mr. Campbell arrived one September afternoon, a middle-aged man with gold-rimmed glasses and an impeccable reputation for never having lost a case where the law was clearly on his client's side. After reviewing all the documentation Thomas had gathered, he smiled for the first time and said with professional conviction, "This is the most solid case I've ever seen. There's no way Mrs. Jenkins can legally challenge it. The question is not whether we will win, but how she will react when confronted with irrefutable evidence." Thomas decided that the confrontation would occur publicly, not in a private conversation where Mrs. Jenkins could manipulate the narrative or make threats away from witnesses. He organized a formal dinner at the homestead, inviting not only Mrs. Jenkins and her children, but also Reverend Miller, Mr. Thompson, the solicitor, Mr. Campbell, the barrister, and several respectable citizens from the district who had known Mr. George Watson and had an interest in seeing justice done. Mrs. Jenkins could not refuse without appearing suspicious, so she accepted the invitation with a tense smile and calculating eyes that tried to decipher Thomas's intentions. She still believed she controlled the situation. She still thought she could manipulate that wealthy man from Sydney to close advantageous deals before driving him away. She had no idea of the storm that was about to break over her head, like the fist of God descending from the heavens to crush towers built on foundations of lies. The night of the dinner arrived, charged with a tension that made the air seem electrified, despite the mild autumn temperature of the New South Wales district. Ruby was instructed to serve the table as always, but this time she wore the blue dress Thomas had given her. And there was something different in her posture, something Mrs. Jenkins immediately noticed. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. Clive drank too much wine from the start, nervous, not knowing exactly why, and Mabel chattered incessantly about nothing, filling the silences with empty words. The guests arrived and were seated in the grand dining room, the table covered with an immaculate white tablecloth and decorated with flower arrangements that perfumed the air. Reverend Miller blessed the food with a prayer that seemed to contain double meanings for those who knew what was to come. And then, they began to eat in a climate of superficial cordiality that barely disguised currents of tension flowing beneath the surface. It was only when desserts were served that Thomas stood, requesting everyone's attention with a polite but firm gesture. "I thank everyone for their presence on this special night," he began in a clear voice that reached every corner of the room. "I have gathered you here not only for dinner, but for you to witness a moment of justice that becomes necessary after years of injustice." Mrs. Jenkins immediately tensed, her fingers clutching her cutlery with a force that made her knuckles white. "What are you talking about, Mr. Fraser?" she asked, in a controlled voice, but with a current of venom running underneath. Thomas smiled, but it was a humorless smile, the smile of a predator who had finally cornered his prey after a long hunt. "I am speaking of the truth about Ruby Elizabeth Watson," he replied, and the full name pronounced aloud for the first time in years fell on the table like a silent bomb. "And of how you, Mrs. Jenkins, stole her identity, her inheritance, and her rights for 22 years. The room erupted in murmurs of shock, but Thomas raised his hand, asking for silence, and continued relentlessly. "Ruby is not an illegitimate child without a name, as you always claimed, Mrs. Jenkins. She is the legitimate daughter of Elizabeth Watson and Edward Watson, both deceased, and the blood niece of Mr. George Watson, who administered her properties until his own death." He signaled to Mr. Campbell, who rose and began to distribute copies of the documents to all present. "I have here the birth certificate, the marriage certificate of her parents, property records showing that these lands belonged to Edward Watson and were inherited by his widow Elizabeth. And most importantly, I have Mr. George Watson's will, found in his sealed study 15 years ago, clearly stating that upon reaching 25 years of age, Ruby must assume complete possession of all properties that by right of blood belong to her." Mrs. Jenkins stood up so abruptly that her chair fell backward with a crash that echoed through the room. Her face was white as wax, except for red splotches of rage burning on her cheeks. "This is absurd," she shrieked in a shrill voice that shattered all pretense of aristocratic composure. "That girl is an illegitimate child my husband took in out of pity. There is no will. These lands are mine by right of widowhood." But her denial sounded desperate, even to her own ears. And everyone in the room could see the truth, stamped on her pale face and in her hands trembling with fury and fear. Reverend Miller slowly rose, his old but firm voice cutting through the chaos. "Mrs. Jenkins, I baptized Ruby with my own arms 22 years ago, and I registered her parents with full names in the sacred book of the church. I know who she is, and God also knows. Lies can deceive men, but they do not deceive the Lord. Clive tried to intervene, stammering something about family property and inheritance rights, but Mr. Campbell cut him off with a legal authority that admitted no challenge. By the law of Australia and by the law of God, Ruby Elizabeth Watson is the sole legitimate heir to these properties. She will turn 25 inches 3 weeks, at which point Mr. George Watson's will specifies she must assume complete possession. Any attempt to prevent this will be treated as theft and fraud, crimes punishable by imprisonment. The barrister paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle before continuing. Furthermore, we have legal grounds to sue Mrs. Jenkins for unlawful appropriation of property belonging to another for the past 15 years, which could result in the return of all profits generated by the lands during this period, in addition to compensation for moral damages inflicted on the true owner. The threat was clear and devastating, and Mrs. Jenkins staggered as if she had received a physical blow. Ruby had remained silent throughout the revelation, standing by the wall where she always stood when serving meals. But now all eyes turned to her with a mixture of curiosity, surprise, and, in some cases, a respect she had never received. Thomas extended his hand to her, inviting her to join him in the center of the room. And after a brief hesitation, Ruby walked with steps that started timidly, but gained firmness with each meter traveled. When she finally stood beside him, Thomas took her hand and held it before everyone, a gesture that was both a formal introduction and a non-verbal declaration of his intentions. "Ruby," Thomas said in a soft voice, but one that reached every person present, "these people have come here tonight to witness the restoration of your rights. But before we proceed with the legal procedures, I need you to speak yourself. I need you to say before everyone if you accept your inheritance and if you are willing to assume your legitimate place as owner of these lands." Ruby looked around the room, seeing faces that watched her with attention, some friendly, others shocked, and finally, her eyes fell on Mrs. Jenkins, the woman who had tormented her all her life. For a moment she might have felt fear. She might have retreated to the shadows, where she had lived comfortably, hidden for years. But then she felt Thomas's hand holding hers, firm and encouraging, and remembered everything she had discovered about herself, that she was the daughter of honorable parents, that she had a full and beautiful name, that these lands were hers by right of blood and law, and something within her, something Mrs. Jenkins had tried to kill, but which had stubbornly survived like a seed in arid ground, finally blossomed completely. She raised her chin, straightened her shoulders, and when she spoke, her voice came out clear and firm, with no trace of submission or doubt. "Yes," Ruby said, and the word resonated through the room like a bell announcing a new day. "I am Ruby Elizabeth Watson, daughter of Elizabeth and Edward, niece of Mr. George Watson, and I accept my inheritance as the legitimate owner of these lands and this homestead." She turned to Mrs. Jenkins, and for the first time in 22 years, looked her directly in the eyes without lowering her gaze. "You called me illegitimate all my life. You humiliated me, made me feel I was less than nothing. But I was none of that. I was an orphan child who deserved love and protection, and you only gave me cruelty and lies." Tears streamed down Ruby's face, but they were not tears of weakness or shame. They were tears of liberation, of years of pain finally being validated and recognized before witnesses who could not deny it. "But still, even after all you did to me, I choose not to seek vengeance. I choose only justice, only what is mine by right, and the truth finally exposed to the light of day." The declaration was met with a reverent silence, broken only by Mrs. Jenkins's choked sobs, who finally understood that her reign of terror had ended, that the lies she had built for 15 years were crumbling to dust at her feet, and that there was nothing, absolutely nothing she could do to prevent the justice that arrived implacable as an inevitable tide. The days that followed the dinner were of complete and irreversible transformation. Mr. Campbell moved with impressive efficiency, presenting all documentation to the courts and initiating the formal process of property transfer. The judge appointed for the case, a man named Justice Arthur Reynolds, known for his unbreakable integrity and respect for the law above any personal or social consideration, reviewed the documents with meticulous attention before delivering his verdict. The decision was unanimous and unquestionable. Ruby Elizabeth Watson was indeed the sole legitimate heir to all properties, which included the homestead, the citrus grove that stretched for acres, the storage sheds, the export contracts, and a considerable sum of money deposited in banks in Mr. George Watson's name. but which had been administered by Mrs. Jenkins for 15 years. The court determined that Mrs. Jenkins and her children would have 30 days to vacate the property, and that a full audit of all finances would be conducted to determine if additional compensation for misappropriation of funds belonging to Ruby would be necessary. The news spread through the district like wildfire. People talked in the streets, in the squares, in the churches, about the young servant girl who was actually an heiress whose fortune had been stolen, about the cruel matriarch who had lied for years, about the wealthy man from Sydney who had brought justice when no one else dared to question the established power. Some people saw the story as a fairy tale come true, others as a delicious scandal that would fuel conversations for years, but all agreed it was an extraordinary case of justice finally triumphing over oppression. Ruby became an almost mythical figure overnight, the citrus girl who recovered her stolen kingdom, and although she herself felt uncomfortable with the sudden attention, there was also a deep relief in finally being seen, in finally being recognized as a person of worth and with rights. Thomas remained by her side every step of the process, not as a savior expecting gratitude, but as a companion who offered strength when hers faltered, and guidance when she felt lost in the labyrinth of legal procedures and administrative responsibilities that were now hers. Mrs. Jenkins did not leave peacefully. She fought tooth and nail, hiring lawyers who tried to find legal loopholes, questioning the authenticity of the documents despite official seals and multiple witnesses, spreading poisonous rumors about Ruby, and insinuating that she had seduced Thomas to gain his help. But every attempt crashed against the insurmountable wall of documented and testified truth. Every additional lie only dug deeper the hole into which she herself sank. Clive alternated between impotent rage and pathetic attempts to negotiate with Ruby, offering to divide the property as if he had any bargaining rights. But she rejected every approach with a firm dignity that left no room for manipulation. Mabel, the weakest of the three, collapsed completely, crying in corners and lamenting the loss of social status that had never truly been hers. It was a sad spectacle of a family built on rotten foundations crumbling finally under the weight of its own corruptions. But Ruby felt no pleasure in their destruction, only a distant sadness for lives wasted seeking power through dishonest means. The day of the official transfer arrived on an October morning, when the Australian autumn painted the grove with golden hues and the breeze brought a welcome coolness after months of intense heat. Ruby wore a new dress, this one, chosen by herself for the first time in her life, an elegant model of dark green silk that enhanced her brown eyes and conferred upon her an air of natural dignity that had always been present but could now flourish freely. Her hair was styled simply but beautifully, gathered in a low bun from which soft strands escaped, framing her face. Thomas stood by her side, impeccably dressed in a grey linen suit, his presence solid and comforting, as they walked together towards the solicitor's office, where the final documents would be signed. Mr. Campbell accompanied them, carrying a leather briefcase full of papers that represented months of meticulous work and an absolute legal victory. The ceremony was surprisingly simple, considering the magnitude of what was happening. Mr. Thompson, the old solicitor, whose eyes gleamed with tears of joy at seeing justice finally done, read the terms of the transfer in a clear, official voice. Ruby signed her full name, Ruby Elizabeth Watson, for the first time on legal documents that recognized her true identity, and each letter traced with a slightly trembling hand was an act of reclamation of herself, her history, her future. When the last signature was affixed and the last seal pressed against the red wax, Mr. Thompson smiled with deep satisfaction and uttered the words that officially changed everything. It is done. Ruby Elizabeth Watson is now, before the law of God and of men, the sole and absolute owner of all lands, properties, and assets formerly administered under the name of Mr. George Watson. May God bless her and guide her on her new journey. A soft applause resonated in the small office, coming from the few present who witnessed that historic moment. And Ruby felt something explode in her chest, a mixture of joy, relief, gratitude, and fear of the unknown that awaited her. Thomas took her hand as they left the solicitor's office, intertwining his fingers with hers in a way that left no doubt about the nature of their feelings. They walked together through the streets of the town, and Ruby noticed how people turned to look at them, some greeting with respect, others whispering behind fans and hats, but all recognizing her now not as an invisible servant, but as a landowner and a woman of position. It was a strange and slightly frightening experience, but Thomas's presence by her side made everything bearable, even a little magical. When they returned to the homestead, her homestead now, she had to remind herself, They found Mrs. Jenkins supervising employees, loading trunks and furniture onto wagons parked in the front yard. The deposed matriarch looked at Ruby with an hatred so pure and concentrated that it seemed to have physical substance, but she said nothing, only averted her gaze and continued directing the removal of her belongings with the rigid back of one who refuses to bow, even in defeat. Ruby watched Mrs. Jenkins for a long moment, feeling complex emotions wrestle within her chest. There was satisfaction, yes, at seeing the woman who had tormented her finally facing the consequences of her actions. But there was also sadness for the wasted tragedy of lives lived in bitterness and greed. She approached her former oppressor with measured steps, and when Mrs. Jenkins finally turned to face her, Ruby spoke in a firm, but not cruel, voice. "Mrs. Jenkins," she began, knowing that using the title was more generous than the woman deserved. "I will not sue you for the appropriation of funds during these years, though I have the legal right to do so. I will not seek vengeance for the years of humiliation, though I would also have legal grounds for compensation for moral damages." She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I will let you leave in peace with the dignity you never granted me, because I choose to be better than you were to me. But know this, never again set foot on these lands, never again speak my name, and live the rest of your days knowing that the illegitimate girl you despised became a much better woman than you ever were." The words fell upon Mrs. Jenkins like lashes, each one marking her in ways that legal punishment never could. The matriarch opened her mouth as if to respond, but no sound came out, and finally, she simply turned and climbed into the wagon where Clive and Mabel already waited, both avoiding looking at Ruby as if the shame was too heavy to bear. The wagons slowly departed down the dirt road, leading out of the property, and Ruby stood watching until they completely disappeared on the horizon, feeling that a painful chapter of her life had finally closed. Thomas approached from behind and gently placed his hands on her shoulders, a silent support that said everything words didn't need to say. "You were more merciful than she deserved," he commented softly. Ruby turned to look at him, tears gleaming in her eyes, but a smile touching her lips. "Mercy isn't about what others deserve," she replied with surprising wisdom for someone so young. "It's about who I choose to be, regardless of what they did to me." With Mrs. Jenkins and her children finally off the property, Ruby entered her homestead as its owner for the first time in her life. Each step through the corridors she once traversed as an invisible servant now resonated differently, laden with meaning and possibility. She ascended the main staircase, one she had never been permitted to use, and her fingers glided over the polished, dark wooden banister, while images of a little girl peeking from below flooded her memory. She reached the second floor where the main bedrooms were, and Thomas guided her to a specific door at the end of the corridor. "This was your mother's room," he said gently, turning the doorknob and pushing the door, which creaked slightly after years of being closed. The room was covered in dust, and white sheets protected antique furniture, but even through the years of abandonment, it was possible to see that it had been a beautiful and carefully decorated room. Ruby entered slowly, almost reverently, as if treading sacred ground. Thomas discreetly stepped aside, allowing Ruby a private moment in that space that had been her mother's. She walked to the window and drew back the heavy curtains, letting the sunlight flood the room after years of darkness. Dust danced in the rays of light like tiny stars, and Ruby looked out the window, discovering the perfect view of the citrus grove that stretched as far as the eye could see. Her mother woke up every day looking at that view, Ruby thought, her heart tight with emotion. Her mother had walked through that room, had slept in that bed, had dreamed dreams that were tragically interrupted too soon. Ruby approached the old dresser and carefully opened the top drawer, not knowing what she expected to find. Inside were delicately embroidered handkerchiefs, a rosary of dark wooden beads, and a small, faded blue velvet box. With trembling hands, Ruby opened the box and found inside a silver locket with a delicate chain. The locket opened with a soft click, revealing two painted miniatures. On one side, a handsome man with kind eyes and a neatly trimmed mustache. Her father, Edward, Ruby knew instinctively. On the other side, a woman of delicate beauty, with dark hair and eyes exactly like those Ruby saw in the mirror, her mother, Elizabeth. The tears Ruby had been holding back finally overflowed, streaming down her face in torrents as she held that locket as if it were the most precious thing in the world. There they were, her parents, looking at her through time, faces she had never known in life, but which now she could finally see, study, memorize. She pressed the locket against her chest and cried. But they were not just tears of sadness for what she had lost. They were also tears of healing, of a connection finally established with roots that Mrs. Jenkins had tried to sever, but which proved to be deeper and stronger than any lie could destroy. Thomas found her there, crying silently by the window, and without asking or hesitating, simply wrapped her in his arms and let her weep against his chest until no more tears remained. When Ruby finally calmed down, she pulled away slightly from Thomas, but remained within the circle of his arms, looking up and meeting his brown eyes, full of a tenderness that made her heart race. "Thomas," she said, her voice hoarse from crying, "you gave me back everything: my name, my history, my property, my dignity. But more than all that, you made me feel that I deserved to be loved." The confession hung between them, laden with absolute vulnerability. And Thomas responded in the only way that mattered. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and when she didn't pull away, but instead lifted her face in a silent invitation, he kissed her with a tenderness that contained years of loneliness, finally finding healing in another person, equally marked, but not broken by pain. The kiss was sweet and respectful, a promise sealed with the brush of lips that said more than 1,000 words could say. A mutual commitment to build a future together on a solid foundation of respect, admiration, and love that had grown organically and truly. When they finally separated, both were smiling through tears, and Ruby said, her voice still trembling but full of genuine joy, "I love you, Thomas William Fraser. I don't know when it happened exactly, whether it was when you treated me with kindness for the first time in the Grove, or when you took my hand and promised to discover the truth, or in any of the 1,000 little moments between then and now. But I know that I love you with a certainty I didn't know was possible to feel." Thomas smiled, that rare and precious smile that transformed his serious face into something luminous and young. "I love you too, Ruby," he replied in a firm, clear voice, without hesitation or doubt. "I love your strength, your kindness that survived years of cruelty, your capacity to forgive without forgetting, your courage to reclaim what is yours. I love you not despite your history, but partly because of it, because it shaped you into the extraordinary woman you are." He paused, taking a deep breath before asking the question that would change their lives forever. "Ruby Elizabeth Watson, will you marry me? Will you agree to share your life with me, not as savior and rescued, but as equal companions building a future together?" Ruby didn't need to think, didn't need to hesitate. "Yes," she replied, her voice resonating through the room that had been her mother's and now witnessed the beginning of a new chapter. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They kissed again, this kiss deeper and more passionate, a promise of future nights and shared mornings, of challenges faced together and joys multiplied by being divided. When they finally separated, they were laughing, happiness making them giddy, like those who have just made the most serious and beautiful commitment two human beings can make to each other. Thomas took a small ring from his pocket that had belonged to his mother, a simple gold ring with a small emerald in the center, and placed it on Ruby's finger, where it fit perfectly, as if it had always been destined for her. "My mother would be honored to know it now belongs to you," Thomas said, his voice emotional. "She always said that a person's true worth was measured not by what they possessed, but by how they treated those who could offer nothing in return. You would have been the daughter she would have adored to have." The following months were a period of intense transformation and learning. Ruby immersed herself in the administration of her properties with a dedication that surprised even Thomas, demonstrating a natural intelligence for business that years of humiliation had not managed to suppress. She learned about export contracts, about negotiating with distributors, about managing workers and maintaining groves. Thomas was always by her side, not as a condescending tutor, but as a companion who respected her capacity to learn and grow. They modernized harvesting methods, improved working conditions for employees, established fair and lucrative contracts with European buyers. The citrus grove flourished under Ruby's attentive care, as if the trees themselves knew they were finally in the right hands. The property became a model of success in the region, known not only for the exceptional quality of its fruit, but also for the dignified and fair treatment of its workers, a direct reflection of the values Ruby carried in her heart. The wedding took place the following spring, when the grove was in full bloom and the perfume of wattle blossoms permeated the air like a divine blessing. The ceremony occurred outdoors among the trees that witnessed Ruby's journey, from humiliated worker to restored owner, under the infinite blue sky of New South Wales. Reverend Miller officiated with tears of joy streaming down his wrinkled face, blessing the union of two souls who found each other amidst injustice, and chose to build something beautiful on foundations of truth and mutual respect. Ruby wore a custom-made wedding dress, white as the blossoms falling from the citrus trees around them, and on her neck was the locket that had belonged to her mother as if Elizabeth was present through that precious object to witness the happiness that had been denied to her, but which her daughter finally achieved. Thomas was impeccable in a white linen suit, his eyes fixed on Ruby with a love so evident that no one who saw them could doubt the sincerity of their feelings. The vows they exchanged were simple, yet profoundly meaningful. Ruby promised to love Thomas in joys and sorrows, in the wealth they now possessed, and in any difficulties the future brought. She promised to be a loyal companion and a true partner until death separated them. Thomas promised to always honor Ruby, respect her strength and independence, support her in every challenge and celebrate every victory by her side. He promised to love her not as property, but as an equal, not as rescued, but as a free choice of a heart that had finally learned to love again. When Reverend Miller finally declared them husband and wife, the kiss that sealed their union was witnessed by happy tears from all present station workers who loved Ruby as she had always deserved to be loved, citizens from the district who came to celebrate the triumph of justice over oppression, and the blue sky above, which seemed to smile upon them with divine approval. The feast that followed was a celebration of life, love, and new beginnings. Tables were set under the citrus trees, laden with delicious food and Australian wine that flowed freely. Music filled the air, guitars and accordions, creating cheerful melodies that made people dance on the soft grass of the grove. Ruby and Thomas danced together under the stars that began to appear in the twilight sky, moving in perfect harmony, as if they had danced together all their lives, and not just a few months. Around them, citrus trees, laden with golden fruit, swayed gently in the night breeze. And Ruby thought about how her life had come full circle. She had been born in that grove as the legitimate heir. She had been reduced to a humiliated worker. She had discovered the truth about herself and had reclaimed her inheritance. And now she was marrying the man she deeply loved, surrounded by the same trees that had witnessed every phase of her journey. It was the end of one story and the beginning of another, the closing of a circle of pain and the opening of an ascending spiral of hope and infinite possibilities. Dear listeners, we come to the end of this story, which I hope has touched your hearts as much as it touched mine in the telling. Ruby's journey teaches us that truth, however deeply buried, always finds a way to light. It teaches us that dignity cannot be stolen, only temporarily obscured, and that justice, though sometimes slow, eventually prevails when brave hearts refuse to accept injustice, Gexter, as an immutable fate. It also teaches us that true love is not born of necessity or convenience, but of mutual recognition of worth, of respect built on solid foundations of character and free choice. Ruby and Thomas lived many happy years together in the homestead, surrounded by citrus trees, building not only a prosperous business, but also a loving family. They had children who grew up running among the trees in the grove, listening to stories about their grandmother Elizabeth, whom they never met, but whose locket passed from generation to generation, as a reminder that we are more than circumstances try to make us believe. The grove continued to flourish, producing sweeter fruit each year, as if the trees themselves celebrated the return of justice and love to those lands. And what about Mrs. Jenkins? They say she lived the rest of her days in a small house, in a distant town, consumed by the bitterness of having lost everything she had stolen. But that is a story that does not deserve more of our time, for we choose to focus not on the darkness that was vanquished, but on the light that triumphed. Thank you for accompanying this journey to the end. If you liked it, please leave your like, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next stories, and comment below which part touched your hearts the most. Until the next story, which will undoubtedly bring more emotions, more justice, and more love to warm your souls. See you soon, dear listeners.